This week's list gives us a pretty big difference from last week's list. Last week had some tough poems, and this week has some tough poems, but the reason that last week's poems were tough was mostly that the language was very old. This language is 100 years closer to our time, and yet the poems aren't necessarily any easier to understand, but it's less because the language is old than it is because the structure and the thought of the poems is often more elaborate. What's happened in poetry from Shakespeare's time to this time, 100 years later, is that the audience has changed. So we had works that were court poems meant for court people in the 16th and 17th centuries. And now we have professional poets writing philosophical poems for the educated and common poems for the common person. So we have this different variety of poems, and the educated people like Pope and Collins, they're people who know Latin, and they're modeling their poems on Latin poetry. It's one of the reasons they call this the Neo-Classical age. And so they have some elaborate stuff going on here. So I'm going to try to help you with that. I just want to make a few preliminary comments. The ones with the check are the ones that I want to talk about. And it's most of them, but I'm not going to read through every word of all of these. I just want to make sure we see. And I want to start with Swift, Description of the Morning, and then I'm going to move to Collins, the Ode to the Evening, and you might think, well, that's a good pairing. We got the morning and then we got the evening, but we're going to see that it's really not a good pairing at all, because what Swift means by morning at the beginning of the century, or the period, is very different from what Collins means by evening at the end of the period. And then we're going to look at Pope's Essay on Man, because that's a philosophical poem, if there ever was one. Just going to look at a little bit. It's from the first epistle of several. And I'm going to just briefly mention Cowper's Epitaph of the Hare, and then we'll go to Burns' Tam O'Shanter. Tam O'Shanter is, in one sense, the simplest poem of all, but it's probably the hardest to read because it's in Scots and not in regular English. The language is very simple. It just doesn't happen to be yours or mine. All right, so let's go to Jonathan Swift's Description of the Morning. The thing to understand about this poem is that by morning he means the things that are happening in the morning. He doesn't mean what you probably thought when you read the title, a description of the sun coming up and the trees and the birds singing and the lake and the rivers and stuff. You probably thought that, and you probably thought that because you're used to poetry written after this era, than Romantic poetry and later, where that is the norm. Poems written about nature and seems to be what we're supposed to be writing about. But that did not occur to someone in the 18th century. So this is really about what people do in the morning. The second thing to understand about this poem is that it takes common life as its subject. Common people doing common things. Swift wasn't a man to like common things particularly. Well, Swift was kind of not a misogynist, a misanthrope. I mean, he didn't like anybody. So we can't expect a lot of praise here. All right, so I want to talk about a few things that are going on here. So in that first line, now hardly here and there a hackney coach appearing showed the ruddy morn's approach. This is, here are couplets. Also, the image of a hackney coach showing red morning's approach is an allusion to classical poetry. In classical poetry, it would have been Apollo or Phoebus Apollo, he was often called, or sometimes just Phoebus, which is the god who chariots the sun across the sky. So in a poem about morning, it would start with Apollo crossing the heavens in his coach. So now, instead, we've got just an ordinary, essentially a taxi, showing up. Oh, the taxis are out, it must be morning. Which brings it down to earth, but also has a negative connotation, suggesting that we've come a long way from those great days when Apollo crossed the sky. We're down here where the closest thing we have is a taxi. Now Betty, and Betty's just a name for a common person, a servant. So now Betty from her master's bed had flown and softly stole to discompose her own. That's already been described in the discussion board. The slipshod prentice from his master's door had pared the dirt and sprinkled round the floor. Now these images are just common people doing their ordinary things in the morning. Now Moll had whirled her mop with dexterous airs, prepared to scrub the entry and the stairs. So Moll doesn't seem to be doing anything wrong. She's whirling her mop. She's doing her job. Moll and Betty are servants in the house. Betty's the one who's sleeping with the master. Moll is doing her job in the house. The youth with broomy stumps began to trace the kennel edge where wheels had worn the place. These are ordinary things, ordinary people doing on ordinary days, some of them of highly questionable morality, and some of them just what you see in a busy day. He's looking at London in the morning and seeing all of these things, suggesting that this is kind of an ordinary, dull, uninteresting, even slightly immoral world that we live in. The small coal man was heard with cadence deep, till drowned in shriller notes of chimney sweep. Chimney sweeps going through the streets, trying to get people to pay them to sweep the coal out of the chimneys. Duns at his lordship's gate began to meet, and brick dust Moll had streamed through half the street. But, so the bill collectors are all out getting to work, and brick dust Moll who cleans pots with brick dust. The turnkey, now the turnkey's the jailer. Now his flock returning sees, duly let out a night to steal for fees. If you went to jail in the 18th century, you had to pay for your lodging, and so the jailer, in this case, and this really happened, would let them go out at night. They're thieves anyway, so they could steal money to pay for their jail time. Swift thinks this is a little bit immoral, wrong, but he's just noting it. Note that there's no explicit judgment here. The watchful bailiffs take their silent stands while schoolboys lag with satchels in their hands. Schoolboys never want to go to school. So it's just a description of the day, the morning, and how implicitly how far we've come. All right, so that's not hard to read. It's hard to make sense of if you don't see the context of classical poetry and how far we've come down. But once you do, you see that the satire and the humor of the poem is in mixing all of these things together, high and low, mostly low, and suggesting how cheap the world has become. Now this poem is a very difficult poem. It's not because most of that language is terribly difficult. It's because of the very, very elaborate structure of the sentences. I've been saying all semester, you need to pay attention to the sentence, not the line, and it's never more important than in this particular poem, because if you see, the first sentence starts here, and it's got semicolons and commas that whine a very elaborate syntax and grammar, and then it's got a colon down here at line 14, and it's still going, and it finally ends at line 20. So you got to try to suspend all that grammatic structure as you're reading through some pretty elaborate images. and hold all of that in your head. Swift's poem was about people in the morning, the lower class mostly, the common man, not something that has ever been of interest to poets until this period, but now becomes the interest of poets. People like Gay and people like Swift and other poets are and Burns, nobody more than Robert Burns, are suddenly saying these people's lives also belong in poems. Let's look at them. Collins is not thinking that way. This is more of a nature poem, but it's a very 18th century nature poem. So you want to compare this to the nature poetry that we're going to read next week, and you'll find it's extraordinarily different. And they're both, Wordsworth, for example, and Collins are looking at and talking about nature, but they do it in such very different ways. We could even say that Collins is talking about the idea of nature, and Wordsworth will be talking about actual trees and rivers and grass and things, not the idea of nature. Unlike Collins, Wordsworth will be looking at what he's talking about. Collins is just imagining, and not always very well, what he's talking about. So, it starts again with this very classical notion. An oaten stop is a flute made out of oats. A stop is the whole of a flute, or any reed, any instrument like clarinet, whatever. That even organ has stops, right? Any hole that air has to pass through to make the sound, and can be capped to stop the sound, right? So that hole is called a stop. If aught of oaten stop or pastoral song may hope chaste Eve to soothe thy modest ear, like thine own solemn springs, thy springs and dying gales. Okay, we're not anywhere near the end of this sentence, but I'm going to stop because pretty soon you'll be completely lost if I don't. So, if any music from an instrument, or any country song, a pastoral song, is a song of the fields, it's a song of shepherds, may hope chaste Eve. Eve is evening personified. And so he's talking, it's an ode to evening. To tells you that that's what's being addressed in an ode. And he's calling evening Eve. So if anything that I can sing may soothe your modest ear. So Eve is a modest woman. Now, you expect the sentence to have a then at this point, but it doesn't. He's going to suspend that grammar and say, like thy own solemn springs, thy springs and dying gales, which have the sounds, right? So if I can produce a sound that is like the sound of your own springs, like the spring of water, or your winds, O nymph reserved, so it has still nothing to do with then. While now the bright-haired sun, and he's getting so far from his original subject that you wonder if he's ever going to get to the point. He's just delaying and delaying. So now Eve is a nymph, a natural creature out of classical literature, like a female nature goddess. While now the bright-haired sun sits in yon western tent, whose cloudy skirts with breed ethereal wove or hang his wavy bed. So now he's looking at the east where the sun is going down because it's evening, and talking about the sun being in a tent in the sky, and it's got cloudy skirts, and you can see this is such a bizarre image of nature that it hardly is possible to picture. It's like the poem we listened to last week, There's a Garden in Her Face, which created a very strange image. Well, this is a kind of strange image of a sunset. And It's as though he's forgotten his sentence now in this line 9. Now air is hushed, save where the weak-eyed bat with short shrill shriek flits on his leathern wing, or where the beetle winds his small but sullen horn, as oft he rises midst the twilight path against the pilgrim born in heedless hum. So this is all a parenthesis. He's gonna get back to his sentence, but this kind of sits outside of it, even though it's in the middle of it. Now teach me. Okay, so if anything I say can soothe you, then, he says now instead of then, teach me. So you got to connect this part of the sentence to this part of the sentence in order to pick up on the thought. Now teach me, maid composed, again that's Eve, to breathe some softened strain, whose numbers, that's the rhythm, the feet, stealing through thy darkening veil, may not unseemly with its stillness suit. In other words, teach me to write a poem that's got such a meter and such sounds that it fits with, it's appropriate for the stillness of this evening. I want to imitate or match the stillness of this evening with my poem. As musing slow, I hail thy genial loved return. Right? Musing means thinking, but it also means writing, meditating on. So here's that sentence said in another way. I'm going to reread it just so you can try to put all of what I've said together, because it's extraordinarily complicated. Here in my poem, I am hailing or greeting the happy return, the friendly return of evening. So, teach me to write a poem that would be appropriate for the evening that I am experiencing, that would match it in mood and rhythm and tenor. Very elaborate way to say that simple thing. So now that you've processed that much, just listen to it. I'm going to go through that whole sentence. If aught of oaten stop or pastoral song may hope, chaste Eve, to soothe thy modest ear, like thy own solemn springs, thy springs and dying gales, O nymph reserved, while now the bright-haired sun sits in yon western tent, whose cloudy skirts with breed ethereal wove, or hang his wavy bed. Now air is hushed, saved, where the weak-eyed bat with short shrill shriek flits on his leathern wing, or where the beetle winds his small but sullen horn, as oft he rises midst the twilight path, against the pilgrim born in heedless hum. Now teach me, maid composed, to breathe some softened strain, whose numbers, stealing through thy darkening veil, may not unseemly with its stillness suit, as musing slow I hail thy genial loved return. So inspire me to write my poem. Give me the stuff of my poem. Well, he gets through that sentence, and then he goes on. For when thy folding star arising shows his palely circlet, at his warning lamp the fragrant hours and elves who slept in buds the day, and many a nymph who wreathes her brows with sedge and sheds the freshening dew, and lovelier still the pensive pleasures sweet, prepare thy shadowy car. That would be the movement of the night across the sky. So the folding star would be, I presume, the evening star, which starts pale as a lamp. All right, so he's going to keep going. Then lead, calm votress. A votress is someone you're devoted to, like a goddess. In this case, it's Eve. Right? I'm a servant a votary of my votress, which is Eve, this goddess. Then lead, calm votress, where some sheety lake cheers the lone heath, or some time-hallowed pile, or upland fallows gray reflects its last cool gleam. Very elaborate way. The 18th century often had very elaborate poetry. Lead me, Eve, would be the simple paraphrase of that, or summary anyway. Or if chill blustering winds or driving rain prevent my willing feet, be mine the hut that from the mountain's side views wilds and swelling floods and hamlets brown and dim discovered spires. Discovered means uncovered, noticed. And hears their simple bell and marks o'er all thy dewy fingers draw the gradual dusky veil. So suddenly, in 937, we realize he's not actually looking at the evening. He's looking at evening as a intellectual thing, but not as something in front of his actual eyes, because he's talking about what is not in front of him. He seems to be looking at the evening, but now he's talking about winds and rain that weren't there before, and he's going to get even farther and farther from the thing he's actually looking at. While spring shall pour his showers, as oft he wont, as he usually does, and bathe thy breathing tresses, meekest Eve, while summer loves to sport beneath thy lingering light, while sallow autumn fills thy lap with leaves, or winter yelling through his troublous air affrights thy shrinking train and rudely rends thy robes. So, I mean, now winter is personified as a season that tears the robes off Eve. Sure, he means the leaves from the trees, but it's kind of a violent image. So long regarded of thy quiet rule, shall fancy, friendship, science, rose-lipped health thy gentlest influence own, and him thy favorite name. Own is a very common word that's not used very often today in this sense. So have would be better, a word that we'd be more likely to recognize. So now he's gone through all of the seasons. He stopped looking at the moment where the bat was flitting in the first stanza, and now he's looking at all the seasons, evening at every time of year, and just praising it. So that's an 18th century nature poem. Very different from 19th century nature poems. I want you to realize he's not giving you any advice. He's not giving you information that'll be useful to you. He's just praising evening. He's trying to look at it, but he's looking at it as a concept, not as an actual thing, and creating the mood, because this is the period of history where enhancing or exploring a mood seemed to be the purpose of poetry. And so he wants to explore all the moods that you can explore when you look at the evening. And if you're looking for something any more profound than that, you're not going to find it. All right, so now I want to turn to Pope, an essay on man. And there's just a little bit of it here. This is a very long poem. It's, I don't know, 30 pages or so. It's 4 epistles, as I recall. And an epistle means a letter. It's a philosophical poem. This is very important. You would not find poems like this after the 18th century. The two extremes of the 18th century are a poem like this and a poem like To a Hare, which we can look at later, which is a purely sentimental poem. This one is a purely intellectual poem. Pope actually wrote a preface to this poem in which he explained that he wrote this in verse because he found he could express himself more succinctly that way, more in short, precise, clear sentences. Whereas to write it in prose, like normal philosophy, would have just been kind of baggy. This is actually the philosophy of a German philosopher named Leibniz that he has translated into poetic form. So the point that I want you to understand about it is that it gives us a sense of 18th century poetry as very different from 19th century poetry or any poetry after the 18th century. Age of Reason. Don't go thinking he's going to be expressing his emotions or presenting anything that should be open for interpretation. If this is open for interpretation, he's failed. Right? This is as clear, as direct, as single-voiced as you can possibly be. This is as far from what most of the students in this class thought poetry was on day one as you can possibly get. This is nothing, this is no more like that than a story in a newspaper is like that. This has got a very specific meaning that he's going to try to make as clear as possible. So this essay on man tells us that we should study what we understand, and what we understand is what we can see, what we can experience ourselves. Anything we know about God has to come through our knowledge of man. So it's called an epistle, again, that means letter, and this letter is to his friend John Bolingbroke. So he says, "Awake, my St. John," and that's just his name, he's not a saint. "Awake, my St. John. Leave all meaner things to low ambition and the pride of kings. Let us, since life can little more supply than just to look about us and to die, expatiate free o'er all this scene of man, a mighty maze, but not without a plan." So let's ask what we can. Let's start from zero and look around us and ask, what is man's place in the universe? A wild, where weeds and flowers promiscuous shoot, or a garden tempting with forbidden fruit. So what is the world in which we live in? Which image is more precise, more correct? Is it a wild, or is it a garden, or is it both? Together, you and me, John, let us beat this ample field, try what the open, what the covert yield, right, with the open spaces and what the covered spaces, woods and fields and trees and woods. The latent tracks, the giddy heights explore, of all who blindly creep or sightless soar. Eye nature's walks, shoot folly as it flies, and catch the manners living as they rise. Laugh where we must, be candid where we can, but vindicate the ways of God to man. Now you read Milton say, justify the ways of God to man. And Pope is echoing that line deliberately, but he's using the word vindicate, which is a synonym. But to tell us that his job in this poem is the same thing that Milton's job was in his poem. To explore, not through faith, not through religion, but through reason, the man's place in the universe. So, he's got to do his preliminary thoughts. Say first of God above or man below, what can we reason but from what we know? We can't reason about God. In terms of God, we can only reason about things from what our senses tell us, what we can actually know. Of man, what see we but his station here, from which to reason or to which refer? Through worlds unnumbered, though the God be known, 'tis ours to trace him only in our own. He who through vast immensity can pierce, see worlds on worlds compose one universe, observe how system into system runs. What other planets circle other suns? What varied being peoples every star may tell why heaven made us as we are. Right? So that being or person who knows what life is like on other planets and who can compare Earth to Alpha Centauri or whatever you want, can tell us all sorts of things about the universe, but we're not that person. We can only see here and now, and so whatever wisdom or knowledge we are capable of has to be based on what we see here on Earth now. It's a philosophical statement. But of this frame, the bearings and the ties, the strong connections, nice dependencies, gradations just, has thy pervading soul looked through, or can a part contain the whole? Right? So, what have you seen? You've seen all of these things that are earthly. A part cannot contain the whole. You can only reason from the position that you're in. But he's already implying things like the earth is full of gradations from low to high. And I'm not going to go into that, but he's sneaking his apparatus into his poem. Is the great chain that draws all to agree and drawn supports upheld by God or thee? So he's going to reason that there's a lot of things humans cannot know because we're not gods. But he's going to try to know as much as he can, and in the end show that it's enough for us to believe that God exists and the ways of God are just. He'll be able to distinguish between what we need to understand by faith and what we can understand by reason. And he's not going to explore what he can't reason himself into. I'm not going to ask you to understand this poem in philosophical detail. I'm only asking you to understand this small passage and how it fits into the 18th century idea of what a poem is. All right, where are we going from here? All right, so let's go to the absolute opposite end of the spectrum now, to Epitaph on Hair. So I mentioned already that the other part of 18th century poetry beyond philosophy is sentimentality. I should mention that for every period of our literature after the 18th century, sentimental poetry, sentiment has been the death of poetry. I mean, if the poem is sentimental, it's a terrible poem. That's the worst sin that you can commit in a poem. Starting in the 19th century, people just recoil at sentimental poetry. And the reason for that is that a sentimental poem tries to wring a sentiment out of you which is in excess of the poem. They're like cat videos. Now, you're welcome to like cat videos, but cat videos are kind of a cheap, easy way to wring an emotion out of you, and doesn't take much art, and the emotion it brings out of you is pretty shallow. And you can enjoy it, but you're not going to win an Oscar for a cat video. Right? And poetry works in a similar way. It's easy to make people cry at the death of babies, and it's easy to make people laugh at pratfalls, but a sophisticated poem goes beyond that and gets at a deeper, more sublime, more meaningful emotion and experience. However, at this age of our civilization, a lot of otherwise serious poets wrote sentimental poetry, including Robert Burns and William Cowper. So here is his poem to his hare. Now, for those of you who may not know, a hare is not a rabbit. A hare is much larger than a rabbit and much faster and much more dangerous. They will attack you, but and they'll bite you. They be like being attacked by like a medium-sized dog. And they're always wild, right? So this is also, by the way, the period in history where people started adopting animals as pets. Until this time, there certainly were domestic animals, horses and dogs and such, but they were not pets. They were work animals. Your dogs were for hunting or for rat catching or for any number of other things, but all the dogs were bred and they had a job. Right? But now you have things like dogs and cats that don't really have a job. They just keep you company. Right? And this is when that starts in our history. And one animal that they had for a pet was a hare. So he says, "Here lies whom hound did ne'er pursue, nor swifter greyhound follow, whose foot ne'er tainted morning dew, nor ear heard huntsman's hallo. Old Tiny, surliest of his kind, who nursed with tender care, and to domestic bounds confined, was still a wild Jack hare." I'm not going to read the rest of it. I'll let you read that on your own. It's not hard to read, but I wanted to present it as a contrary to what Pope gave us in the essay on man. That one's entirely intellectual. This one's entirely emotional, about the death of a hare. I said when I talked about Swift that poetry was finally looking at common people as a subject for poetry. But now we're even looking at pets as a subject for poetry. And Robert Burns writes a poem, which you can easily look up if you're interested, called "To a Mouse." And it's a sentimental poem about a mouse. It's not even a pet mouse. It's a wild mouse that was killed by a plow. So the focus of poetry has shifted tremendously. It's not about people at court anymore. All right, the last poem that I wanted to look at this week is Tam O'Shanter, and of course it's too long. I didn't make a slide, so let me look it up online. Again, I'm not going to read much of this poem. For one thing, I don't read Scots that well, and for another, you have a brilliant reading of this poem on our website by David Dachis, who's late professor of Scottish literature. He's a Scotsman himself. And I believe if you look under the folder that says Poets Read Their Works, even though it's not Robert Burns, but David Dachis who's reading the work, you'll find the recording of that if it's not on our weekly work thing. And I really suggest you do two things, that you listen to the recording, but that you read the poem at the same time. There's a lot of words in here you won't know because they're not standard English, they're Scots. But very often you'll be able to figure out what the word means by reading it, and at other times you'll be able to figure out what it means by listening to it, because it is a dialect of English. So, lang, for example, means long, right? And you can look up any other words that you need. But the basic story won't be hard to follow, and I'll give you a sense of what that is. But it's a real treat to listen to this poem because it's really beautiful, and the story it tells is entertaining. It's a great poem for Halloween. And it's worth the time. It seems daunting because it sounds like it's being just read in a foreign language, but it really isn't. It just takes a few minutes to orient yourself into the sounds and the language, and you'll miss a few words. Don't worry about it. I've been reading this poem for 20 years at least, and I still have to look up certain words every time and think, what does that mean? I don't know. And then I just look it up. But most of them you'll actually be able to figure out. You'll be surprised how many you can figure out, right? So I'm just going to look at a little bit of it and then kind of quickly go over the story with you, and then ask you to listen to it. It's really quite a story. Robert Burns, by the way, is the most important poet ever to come from Scotland. He's one of the world's great poets, one of history's great poets. You know him, whether you realize it or not, as the author of Auld Lang Syne. Same Scots dialect in that. People often say, what does this poem mean? Should old acquaintance be forgotten, never brought to mind? Well, old, A-U-L-D, just means old, and you see it in this poem as well. It's a pretty simple poem. It's not hard to understand, but you got to give it just a little bit of effort. So the poem starts with Tam sitting at a bar with his buddy drinking. He does this all the time. He's quite a drinker. So when Chapman Billies leave the street and Ruthie neighbors meet, as market days are wearing late and folk begin to talk the gate, while we sit boozing, see, that's one of those words, boozing, literally means drinking booze, right? At the nappy, getting foo means drunk, and unco means uncommonly. They still use this word in Scotland all the time. And I think they use foo as well. Getting foo and unco happy. We think now on the long Scots miles, the mosses, waters, slaps, and stiles that lie between us and our hame is home, where sits our sulky, sullen dame, gathering her brows like gathering storm, nursing her wrath to keep it warm. So while we're drinking at the bar at night, getting real happy, we're not worried about how we gonna get home, how far our wife is, where she is, and how she's really angry that we're not coming home, because we're just having a good time. It's the end of market days. We saw that in Concord, market days. This truth found honest Tam O'Shanter, as he frae air I nicked did canter, old air wham means when, ne'er a town, no, whom, excuse me, means whom ne'er a town surpasses for honest men and bonny lasses. Right. So after presenting the character, the poet talks to the character, O Tam. This is called apostrophe, right? He's talking to a character in a poem, as though the character could hear him. Hadst thou been sae wise, and ta'en thy ain wife Kate's advise, she told thee weel thou was a skellum. So you don't even have to know what a skellum is to know that that's an insult, right? She told you well that you are a skellum, a blethering, blustering, drunken blellum. You can look these words up and find out exactly what they mean. I can never remember. I always have to look them up. But you don't really need to know. You know that, as with Jabberwocky, he's being insulted. That frae, which means from November till October, a market day, thou wast not sober. Right? On market days, you're never sober. That ilka means same. That comes from the Old English word ilk. That ilka melder with the miller, thou sat as long as thou had siller, right? So you sat with the miller as long as you had silver. As long as you had money to spend on drink, you were drinking. That every nag was called the shoe on, the smith and thee got roaring foo on, right? So you with the miller sat drinking, you with the smith who put the shoes on the nag, right? The nag is a horse, got roaring drunk. That at the Lord's house, even on Sunday, thou drank with Kirkton Jean till Monday. This is what he's like, every October to November. Actually, it's just from November to October, so that's the whole year, right? She prophesied, she being Kate, that late or soon thou would be found deep drowned in Doon, or catched with warlocks in the murk, by Alloway's old haunted kirk. A kirk is a church. Right? So his wife prophesied that he's going to be dead on the side of the road, or he's going to be caught by warlocks by the haunted church. Well, I told you I wouldn't go through the whole thing. I think this poem's so wonderful I kind of want to go through the whole thing, but I won't, because you can listen to David Daiches read it. I'll just tell you the story. It gets late, the storm's coming, and the wind is blowing, and the thunder and lightning are cracking, and he's got to go home. Bars closed, and he's got to go home. He hops on his horse, Meg, a better never lifted leg, and drives home, and he comes to Alloway's old haunted church, and there he sees all these dead spirits rise with, murderers and witches and warlocks, and this one beautiful young witch who must have died young, who's wearing nothing but what he calls a cutty sark, which is a slip, excuse me, and she's dancing, and he's just watching. He's drunk out of his mind, and he's dancing and watching, and he's so thrilled with watching this woman that he yells out, "Well done, Cutty Sark," which is down here somewhere. And then they notice him, and they chase him. I'm missing a lot of great details. You don't want to miss these details, because they're really, especially if you like Halloween, it's really fun. And they take after him and chase him to the river. Now, there's a rule with the undead or the spirits. Here's where he says, "Well done, Cutty Sark." Right there. And in an instant all was dark, and scarcely had he Maggie rallied his horse, when out the hellish legion sallied. And then we get a metaphor, or a simile actually, as bees bizz out with angry fyke when plundering herds assail their bike. So they're like a bunch of bees that are chasing him. Their nest has been disturbed. As open pussy's mortal foes, when pop she starts before their nose, as eager runs the market crowd, when catch the thief resounds aloud. These are just metaphors of how, or similes of how, the spirits are going to chase Tam to the bridge. So Maggie runs, the witches follow, with many an eldritch screech and hollow. Ah, Tam, thou get thy farin', in hell they'll roast thee like a herrin'. In vain thy Kate awaits thy comin', Kate soon will be a woeful woman. Now do thy speed. So do thy speedy utmost, Meg. So the poet is talking to the characters, and he's worried that Tam's not going to make it home. So get moving and win the key stain of the brig, the keystone, the one that holds up the stone bridge. I put a picture on our announcements page this week of this actual scene, and I drew the keystone because the original, so you'll see the keystone's a slightly different color because the original picture didn't have the keystone in it, which was kind of foolish. So I changed the picture and drew a keystone on it, and you'll see the keystone on the bridge. That's the center point of the bridge. And if you can make the keystone of the bridge, you're safe, because spirits cannot cross moving water. So they run. There's a big, fierce run toward the keystone. There at them thy tail may toss, a running stream they dare not cross. But ere the keystone she could make, she is the horse, the fainted tail she had to shake, the fiend. Right at her tail she had to shake a fiend. For Nanny, that's the young woman in the cutty sark. For before the rest, hard upon noble Maggie pressed, and flew at Tam with furious ettle, but little wist means to know, or knew in this case, but little wist she Maggie's mettle, what a great horse, remember, better never lifted leg. Aye, spring brought aft her master hail, but left behind her ain grey tail. The carlin clocked her by the rump, and left poor Maggie scarce a stump. So that's how close he came to being caught by the witches. This Nanny grabbed the horse's tail and pulled it right off, but he got home safe. And then it's got a moral, which is really fun, and I think we've got to take it as a little tongue-in-cheek. Now wha this tale of truth shall read, ilk man and mother's son, take heed. Whene'er to drink you are inclined, or cutty sarks run in your mind, think you may buy the joys or dear. Remember Tam O'Shanter's mare and his horse. So, one thing we can talk about in the discussion board is how seriously we should take this moral. So, we've seen the intellectual, the philosophical, the sentimental, and now we've seen just this great little story poem. So quite a wide variety of poetry in the 18th century. And that, I think, will do it for this week. That should give you plenty to talk about. See you soon.